Millionaire hires single mother for 1 week for a fake wedding. What she says at the ceremony leaves all the guests stunned. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Sarah Miller wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, careful not to smudge her makeup. The small diner where she worked was packed, and she was the only waitress on duty. Again. Her colleague had called in sick at the last minute, leaving her to handle the lunch rush alone. But she couldn't complain. Every extra hour meant more money for Tommy's college fund. "Miss, this coffee is cold." A man in an expensive suit waved his cup at her, his voice carrying across the diner. Sarah forced a smile and hurried over, already reaching for the coffee pot. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you a fresh cup right away." She poured the steaming coffee, trying to ignore the way he scrutinized her every move. The man's companion, hidden behind a newspaper, remained silent. "And my eggs were supposed to be over easy, not over medium," the suit continued, his tone growing more demanding. "I specifically asked for over easy." Sarah's smile didn't waver, though her patience was wearing thin. "I'll have the kitchen make you a new plate right away, sir. No charge, of course." As she turned to leave, the man grabbed her wrist. "Listen, I don't think you understand. When I pay for breakfast, I expect it to be perfect. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention to your customers." The coffee pot trembled slightly in Sarah's other hand. She thought of Tommy, waiting at Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment after school, probably working on his science project. She thought of the stack of bills on her kitchen counter and the second job she'd have to rush to after this shift. She couldn't afford to lose this job, no matter how much she wanted to pour the scalding coffee over this man's perfectly pressed suit. "I understand completely, sir," she said, gently but firmly removing her wrist from his grip. "And I appreciate your feedback. Now, if you'll allow me, I'll get your eggs prepared exactly the way you like them." The man's companion finally lowered his newspaper, and Sarah caught a glimpse of penetrating grey eyes studying her with unexpected intensity. There was something different about his gaze, not condescending like his companion's, but curious, almost appreciative. "That won't be necessary," the man with the newspaper said, his voice deep and authoritative. "We're finished here, Richard." He placed several $100 bills on the table, far more than their breakfast could have cost. "Keep the change." As they stood to leave, Sarah noticed how the other diners seemed to shrink away, as if trying to become invisible. The man with the grey eyes moved with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. His suit probably cost more than she made in 6 months. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, but he was already walking away, his difficult companion trailing behind him like a chastised schoolboy. Sarah exhaled slowly, her hands still shaking slightly. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, but she had no time to dwell on it. There were other customers waiting, and Tommy's tutor needed to be paid by the end of the week. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of coffee refills and forced smiles. By the time she hung up her apron, her feet were throbbing, and she had exactly 45 minutes to get across town to her evening job at the department store. Outside, the autumn wind whipped through her thin jacket. Sarah pulled it tighter around herself, mentally calculating how many more double shifts she'd need to work to cover Tommy's upcoming school field trip. At 8 years old, he was already so bright, so curious about the world. She refused to let their circumstances dim that light in his eyes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Tommy ate his dinner. He's doing homework now. Don't worry, mijita." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar mix of gratitude and guilt. Mrs. Rodriguez was a godsend, watching Tommy during her evening shifts for much less than she should charge. But it wasn't fair to either of them, this constant juggling act, this endless struggle to stay afloat. As she waited at the bus stop, Sarah allowed herself a moment of weakness. She thought of Tommy's father, who'd walked out before their son was even born. She thought of her own parents who'd made it clear they wouldn't support her decision to keep the baby. She thought of all the dreams she'd put aside, all the nights. She'd cried herself to sleep, wondering if she was doing enough, being enough. The bus was late and Sarah watched the sky darken, knowing she'd have to explain to her supervisor why she wasn't exactly on time. Again. She closed her eyes, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Something had to change. She just didn't know what or how. What Sarah didn't know was that at that very moment, in a sleek office 40 stories above the city streets, the man with the grey eyes was watching a security video of her interaction at the diner, a thoughtful expression on his face. On his desk lay a file with her name on it, and beside it, a contract that would change both their lives forever. The department store was nearly empty when Sarah arrived, out of breath and 5 minutes late. Her supervisor, Martha, gave her a disapproving look but said nothing. They both knew Sarah was one of the hardest workers there, even if her punctuality wasn't perfect. "Cosmetics section today," Martha said, handing her a name tag. "The holiday season's coming up, and we need someone who can handle the entitled customers without losing their cool." Sarah nodded, grateful that at least here she didn't have to worry about spilling hot coffee on anyone. She made her way to the brightly lit cosmetics counter, straightening her slightly wrinkled uniform. The fluorescent lights were unforgiving, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes that even careful makeup couldn't completely hide. The evening dragged on, filled with customers asking about the latest anti-aging creams and luxury perfumes. Sarah demonstrated products she could never afford, explaining their benefits with practiced enthusiasm. Every sale meant a small commission, and every dollar counted. It was nearly closing time when she noticed him. The man from the diner, with those same penetrating grey eyes, was standing near the cologne display. Her heart skipped a beat. He wasn't with his rude companion this time, but something about his presence made her nervous all the same. He approached the counter with measured steps, and Sarah straightened her spine, professional smile firmly in place. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you today?" "Miss Miller," he said, and the fact that he knew her name sent a chill down her spine. "I was hoping to find you here." Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, but do I know you?" "Alexander Blackwood," he introduced himself, extending a manicured hand. "And no, you don't know me, but I'd like to change that. I have a business proposition for you." The name hit her like a physical force. Alexander Blackwood, the billionaire, CEO whose face regularly graced business magazines, the man who'd built an empire from nothing and was known for his ruthless business tactics. What could someone like him possibly want with her? "I'm working, Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "and I'm not sure what kind of business proposition you could have for a department store employee." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you this is worth your time. I've arranged with your supervisor for you to take your break now. 15 minutes in the coffee shop across the street. That's all I ask." Sarah glanced at Martha, who was watching their interaction with poorly concealed curiosity. Her supervisor gave a quick nod, and Sarah realized she had little choice. Whatever this was, she couldn't afford to make a scene at work. 15 minutes, she agreed. The coffee shop was empty, except for a barista who looked ready to close up. Blackwood ordered 2 expensive coffees that Sarah wouldn't have been able to justify buying on her best day. They sat in a corner booth, and Sarah fought the urge to check her phone for messages about Tommy. "I'll be direct," Blackwood said, his voice low and controlled. "I need a wife." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Excuse me?" "A temporary wife," he clarified, as if that made it any less absurd. "For 1 week. I'm willing to pay you $500,000 for your time and discretion." The amount of money made Sarah's head spin, but she forced herself to focus. "Why me?" "Because you're authentic," he said, studying her with those unnerving eyes. "I watched how you handled that situation this morning. You have dignity, resilience, and most importantly, you're completely disconnected from my social circle. No one would ever suspect you of being part of an arrangement." Sarah's mind raced. The money could change everything. Tommy's education, their living situation, their entire future. But nothing was ever that simple, especially when it came to billionaires and secret arrangements. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm negotiating a merger with a traditional family-owned company," They value stability and family connections. My reputation, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say they need convincing that I'm not just another corporate raider. A stable, happy marriage would go a long way toward securing their trust. And you can't find someone in your own social circle for this? His expression hardened slightly. Everyone in my circle wants something. Power, status, connections. You, Miss Miller, only want security for your son. Yes, I know about Tommy. I know about your 2 jobs, your struggle to make ends meet. The father who abandoned you both. I know everything I need to know. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable. The fact that he'd investigated her life should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her. This was business to him, nothing more. And maybe, just maybe, it could be her chance to finally get ahead. What exactly would this week involve? She asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Blackwood's lips curved into a satisfied smile, as if he'd known all along she would ask that question. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Everything is detailed in here, he said, sliding it across the table. Read it carefully. If you agree, be at this address tomorrow at 9 a.m. If not, forget this conversation ever happened. He stood, straightening his already perfect suit. Oh, and Miss Miller, don't be late. Sarah watched him leave, the envelope heavy in her hands. Through the coffee shop window, she saw him slide into a waiting black car that probably cost more than she'd make in a lifetime. The sensible thing would be to throw the envelope away and forget this insane proposition. Instead, she carefully tucked it into her purse, next to the photo of Tommy she always carried. Sometimes she realized the most dangerous decisions were the ones that felt like they'd been waiting to happen all along. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope in her small kitchen. Tommy was finally asleep, and the quiet of the apartment was broken only by the humming of the old refrigerator. The contract inside was thick, printed on expensive paper that felt foreign between her calloused fingers. The terms were meticulously detailed. For 1 week, she would pose as Alexander Blackwood's devoted wife. They would attend social events, be seen at exclusive restaurants, and present themselves as a happily married couple to his business associates. She would need to learn proper etiquette, memorize key details about their supposed relationship, and maintain absolute discretion. In return, she would receive $50,000 up front for preparations and the remaining $450,000 after successfully completing the week. The amount made her dizzy. It was more money than she could earn in 10 years of double shifts. But it wasn't just about the money. As Sarah read through the contract, she found herself studying the photographs included in the packet. They showed the venues where they'd be appearing, the luxury hotel where she'd be staying, the designer boutiques where she'd be getting a new wardrobe. It was like glimpsing into another world, one she'd only seen in magazines or through the department store's display windows. A soft sound from Tommy's room made her quickly hide the contract. She tiptoed to his door, watching him sleep peacefully, surrounded by his science books and solar system models. He was so much like her, determined, curious, always trying to understand how things worked. But unlike her, he wouldn't have to give up his dreams, not if she could help it. Sarah pulled out her phone and Googled Alexander Blackwood. The images that appeared showed him at charity galas, board meetings, and exclusive events. In every photo, he maintained that same controlled expression she'd seen earlier. The articles painted him as brilliant but ruthless, a man who had built his empire through strategic acquisitions and bold market moves. One particular article caught her attention. It mentioned a failed engagement 2 years ago to socialite Victoria Hammond. The piece was sparse on details, but the comments speculated about Victoria's recent return to the city and her apparent attempts to reconnect with Blackwood. Sarah's finger hovered over Mrs. Rodriguez's number. The elderly woman had become more than just Tommy's babysitter. She was the closest thing to family they had. But how could she explain this situation? How could anyone understand that sometimes the most impossible choices were actually the only choices you had? Instead of calling, Sarah returned to the kitchen table and read the contract again, this time focusing on the schedule. The week would coincide with Tommy's upcoming school camping trip, a trip she'd been worried about affording. The timing seemed almost too perfect, as if Blackwood had orchestrated every detail. The contract included a confidentiality agreement that extended well beyond the week of their arrangement. She would never be able to tell anyone about this, not even Tommy. The thought of lying to her son made her stomach churn, but hadn't she already been living with necessary lies? Every time she told him everything was fine, every time she hid her exhaustion behind a smile, every time she pretended that their life was exactly as it should be. A page at the back of the packet contained personal information she would need to memorize: Alexander's favorite foods, his hobbies, how they supposedly met at a charity event 6 months ago. Their courtship had been private, the story went, away from the media's prying eyes. The whirlwind romance had culminated in an intimate wedding ceremony on his private island. Sarah walked to her bedroom's small window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Alexander Blackwood was probably in his penthouse office, confident that she would accept his offer. The thought should have angered her, his assumption, his control over the situation. Instead, she felt a strange flutter in her stomach. For the first time in years, she was about to take a risk, to step off the exhausting treadmill of survival and into something entirely unknown. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the diner, how different his gaze had been from his companions. There had been something there, recognition perhaps, of a shared understanding about masks and necessity. The night grew deeper, and Sarah made lists in her head. The people she'd need to notify about taking time off from work, the arrangements she'd need to make for Tommy, the questions she should ask before agreeing to this insane proposition. But beneath all the practical considerations, a voice whispered that this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about possibility, about stepping through a door that had mysteriously opened in the solid wall of her reality. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Sarah Miller made her decision. She carefully signed the contract, her signature looking out of place next to Alexander's bold scrawl. Then she wrote 2 notes, one for her supervisors requesting emergency personal leave, and one for Mrs. Rodriguez, asking her to keep an extra careful eye on Tommy while she was away on a work training program. As she finally lay down to sleep, Sarah realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about bills or schedules or stretching her paycheck. Instead, she was wondering what it would feel like to hold Alexander Blackwood's hand, to look into those penetrating grey eyes and pretend to be in love. It was just acting, she told herself firmly. Just business. But as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more complicated than a simple business arrangement. In less than 6 hours, she would walk into Alexander Blackwood's world, and nothing in her life would ever be the same. The address led Sarah to a discreet boutique in the city's most exclusive shopping district. At precisely 9 a.m., she pushed open the heavy glass door, feeling immediately out of place in her worn coat and sensible shoes. An elegant woman with silver-streaked hair approached her with a knowing smile. "Miss Miller? I'm Diana Preston, Mr. Blackwood's personal image consultant. We've been expecting you." She gestured toward a private room at the back of the boutique. "Shall we begin your transformation?" The next several hours passed in a blur of fabric, measurements, and instructions. Diana proved to be both efficient and thorough, orchestrating a team of stylists, makeup artists, and behavior coaches. Sarah was measured, styled, and educated on everything from proper table etiquette to the correct way to air-kiss socialites. "Remember," Diana said as a hairdresser worked on Sarah's hair, "you're not just wearing designer clothes, you're stepping into a new identity. Every movement, every gesture must convey elegance and confidence." Sarah watched in the mirror as her ordinary brown hair was transformed into a sophisticated style that made her cheekbones look higher, her neck longer. The makeup artist worked subtle magic, enhancing her features while maintaining a look that wouldn't seem out of place at morning meetings or afternoon tea. "Mr. Blackwood was very specific about keeping your essential nature," Diana commented, studying the transformation with critical eyes. "He said your authenticity was your greatest asset. We're just refining it." The clothes came next, racks of designer pieces in subtle, expensive fabrics. Each item was tailored to fit her perfectly, creating a wardrobe that probably cost more than her annual salary. Sarah tried not to look at the price tags, focusing instead on memorizing which pieces were appropriate for which occasions. The blue Chanel for business meetings, Diana instructed, the cream Valentino for lunch with the board members' wives, and this black Dior C. She held up a dress that made Sarah's breath catch. This is for tomorrow night's gala. As the final touches were being made to her hair, the boutique's door chimed. Sarah's heart skipped as Alexander Blackwood walked in, his presence immediately filling the space. He paused, studying her reflection in the mirror with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "Excellent work, Diana," he said finally, his voice carrying that same quiet authority she remembered. "Miss Miller, you look appropriate." Sarah met his eyes in the mirror, surprising herself with her steady gaze. "Just appropriate, Mr. Blackwood?" A flicker of something, amusement, approval, crossed his face. "We'll work on the name. You can't keep calling me Mr. Blackwood if we're supposed to be madly in love." "Alexander, then." She tested the name on her tongue, watching his reaction. "Alex," he corrected. "Only my board members and my mother call me Alexander." He moved closer, and Sarah caught a hint of his expensive cologne. "We need to practice being comfortable with each other. May I?" He extended his hand, and Sarah understood what he was asking. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in his. His fingers were warm, his grip confident but gentle as he helped her up from the styling chair. They stood face to face, and Sarah was struck by how tall he was, how his presence seemed to envelop her. "Better," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "But you're still too tense. A woman in love doesn't flinch when her husband touches her." "Maybe she does if she's still getting used to public displays of affection," Sarah countered, finding her voice. "Not every love story is the same." This time his smile reached his eyes. "No, they're not. We'll use that. The shy private wife who's adjusting to the spotlight. It fits with our narrative of a whirlwind romance conducted away from prying eyes." Diana cleared her throat discreetly. "Mr. Blackwood, we should discuss the schedule for tomorrow's gala. The press will be there, and the Hansons, the family we're trying to impress," Alex explained to Sarah, still holding her hand. "Old money, very traditional. They need to believe that I'm not just a corporate shark looking to strip their company for parts." "And am I supposed to help convince them of that?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "You already are," he said softly, reaching up to brush an imaginary strand of hair from her face. The gesture was practiced, performative, but something in his touch made Sarah's skin tingle. The right wife can humanize even the most notorious businessman. Diana began reviewing their schedule, but Sarah found it hard to concentrate. Alex had released her hand, but remained close, his presence both unsettling and oddly comfortable. She caught glimpses of them in the boutique's mirrors, the powerful CEO and his elegant wife, a perfect picture of success and romance. The illusion was flawless, but Sarah couldn't help wondering what lay beneath it. What had happened with Victoria Hammond? Why did a man like Alexander Blackwood need to create such an elaborate charade? And most troubling of all, why did his touch, even when purely for show, feel like it was awakening something she'd locked away long ago? As they left the boutique, Alex's hand resting lightly on her lower back, Sarah realized she was no longer playing a role. Somewhere between the makeup chair and this moment, she had stepped fully into this new reality. The question was, could she step back out when the week was over? The presidential suite at the Belmont Hotel felt bigger than Sarah's entire apartment. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle far below, while her hands smoothed invisible wrinkles from her black Dior gown. In just 30 minutes, she would make her debut as Mrs. Alexander Blackwood at one of the city's most prestigious charity galas. "Remember," Alex's voice came from behind her, "the Hansons will be watching our every move. Margaret Hanson is particularly perceptive. She prides herself on being able to spot gold diggers and social climbers." Sarah turned to face him, momentarily struck by how handsome he looked in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. "And what am I supposed to be? Besides, your loving wife, of course." "Be yourself," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Just the version of yourself that had the advantages of a good education and refined upbringing. He paused, studying her. "You look beautiful, by the way." Diana outdid herself. The compliment caught her off guard. It wasn't part of their carefully rehearsed script, and something in his tone made it feel genuine. "Thank you," she managed, grateful that the expensive makeup could hide her blush. Alex crossed the room to stand before her, his expression serious. "There's something else you should know. Victoria might be there tonight." "Your ex-fiancée?" Sarah's stomach tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. "She's on the charity's board of directors. I couldn't prevent her attendance without raising suspicions." He reached out, straightening the delicate diamond necklace he'd provided for the evening. His fingers brushed against her collarbone, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Just stay close to me. We can handle this." The elevator ride to the ballroom was silent, filled with a tension that Sarah couldn't quite name. Alex's hand rested on her lower back, warm and steady, as they walked through the ornate doors. The room was a vision of crystal chandeliers, floating champagne trays, and elegant evening wear. "Darling," a woman's voice cut through the ambient noise. "You've been hiding this lovely creature from us." Margaret Hanson approached, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her keen eyes taking in every detail of Sarah's appearance. Behind her walked her husband, Robert Hanson, the patriarch whose approval could make or break Alex's business deal. "Margaret, Robert," Alex's voice carried just the right amount of warmth. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Sarah." Sarah channeled every lesson Diana had drilled into her. "It's a pleasure to meet you both. Alex has told me so much about your family's remarkable business legacy." Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Has he? And yet we've heard so little about you, my dear. Such a private courtship." "Some things are too precious to share with the world," Alex interjected smoothly, his arm sliding around Sarah's waist. "When you find real love, you want to protect it." The way he said it, the gentle squeeze he gave her waist, it felt so natural that Sarah almost believed it herself. She leaned into him slightly, playing her part. "Alex can be quite old-fashioned that way. It's one of the things I love about him." Robert Hanson nodded approvingly. "A man's private life should be private. Too many young people today want to broadcast every moment on social media." The conversation flowed easier after that, touching on safe topics like charity initiatives and the upcoming symphony season. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the discussion, especially when Robert mentioned his passion for astronomy, something she knew about from helping Tommy with his science projects. "You seem quite knowledgeable about the cosmos." "Mrs. Blackwood," Robert commented, clearly impressed. "My son is fascinated by space," Sarah replied without thinking. The moment the words left her mouth, she felt Alex's arm tighten around her waist. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Your son? I wasn't aware that Alexander had a stepson." Before Sarah could panic, Alex smoothly interjected, "Tommy is actually Sarah's nephew. She's been his guardian since her sister's accident. It's one of the many things that made me fall in love with her, her dedication to family." The lie was perfect, fitting seamlessly into their narrative while explaining Tommy's existence. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward Alex, even as guilt gnawed at her for denying her own son. "How wonderful," Margaret said, but her tone had cooled slightly. "Oh, look who's just arrived." Sarah followed Margaret's gaze to the ballroom entrance. A stunning woman in a red gown was making her entrance, turning heads with every step. Even from across the room, Sarah could feel the newcomer's magnetic presence. "Victoria," Alex said quietly, his body tensing beside Sarah. "She's earlier than expected." Victoria Hammond moved through the crowd like a shark through water, her smile brilliant but predatory. As she approached their group, Sarah felt Alex pull her closer, his fingers pressing into her hip possessively. "Alexander?" Victoria purred, air-kissing his cheek with practiced familiarity. And this must be the mysterious new Mrs. Blackwood. What a surprising development. The challenge in Victoria's voice was unmistakable. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes on them, waiting to see how this encounter would play out. The night had suddenly become much more complicated than any of Diana's careful preparations could have anticipated. Sarah had never considered herself a particularly good actress, but something about Victoria's calculated smile awakened a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. She met the other woman's gaze steadily, allowing genuine warmth to fill her expression. "Victoria, I've heard so much about your work with the charity board," Sarah said, her voice carrying just the right note of admiration. "The children's education initiative is particularly impressive." Victoria's perfect smile faltered slightly, clearly thrown by Sarah's gracious response. "How thoughtful of you to keep up with our work, though I must say Alexander never mentioned you during all our recent lunch meetings." Alex's hand tightened on Sarah's waist. "Perhaps because those lunch meetings existed only in your imagination. Victoria, Sarah and I value our privacy." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret Hanson watched the exchange with barely concealed interest while Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Privacy," Victoria repeated, her laugh like tinkling glass. "Is that what we're calling it? And here I thought you were just ashamed of your new arrangement." Sarah felt Alex preparing to respond, probably with something cutting that would only escalate the situation. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his heart, feeling its rapid beat through his expensive shirt. "Darling," she said softly, but loud enough for their audience to hear it. "Shouldn't we check on the silent auction? You promised to show me that painting you thought would be perfect for the library." The gesture was intimate, natural, and completely unplanned. Alex looked down at her with surprise that quickly melted into something else, something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. "Of course, love," he murmured, covering her hand with his own. "If you'll excuse us." As they walked away, Sarah could feel Victoria's glare burning into her back. They maintained their composed facade until they reached a quiet corner near the auction displays. "That was impressive," Alex said, finally releasing her waist but keeping her hand in his. "Where did you learn to handle someone like Victoria?" Sarah thought of all the difficult customers she'd managed over the years, all the times she'd had to swallow her pride and maintain her dignity. Sometimes the best defense is genuine kindness. It throws people off when they're expecting a fight. Alex studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Sarah Miller. Is that a good thing?" "I'm not sure yet." He glanced around the room, his expression thoughtful. "The Hansons were watching. Your handling of Victoria might have actually helped our cause." Sarah followed his gaze to where Margaret Hanson was now in deep conversation with her husband, occasionally glancing their way. "She didn't believe you about Tommy being my nephew." "No, but she admired how you protected him by playing along," Alex said quietly. "Family loyalty is important to them, and you managed to show it without seeming calculating." The music changed to something slow and romantic. Alex turned to her, extending his hand. "We should dance, it's expected." Sarah placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. Diana had insisted on dancing lessons, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of being in Alex's arms, moving to the music, while dozens of curious eyes watched them. "Relax," he whispered, drawing her closer. "You're too tense. A woman in love would melt into her husband's embrace." Sarah looked up at him, intending to make a witty response, but the words died in her throat. There was something different in his expression, a softness she hadn't seen before. Acting on instinct, she let herself relax into his hold, her head coming to rest naturally against his shoulder. His breath caught slightly, his hand tightening on her waist. They moved together as if they'd done this 100 times before, their bodies finding a natural rhythm that had nothing to do with Diana's careful instructions. "Victoria is watching," Alex murmured against her hair. "Everyone is watching," Sarah replied softly. "That's the point, isn't it?" He pulled back slightly to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "Is it?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah felt herself getting lost in his gaze, in the warmth of his hand on her back, in the faint scent of his cologne. This was dangerous territory, feeling things that weren't part of the script, wanting moments that weren't covered in the contract. The song ended, but they remained close, suspended in a moment that felt both real and impossibly fake. Finally, Alex stepped back, offering his arm to escort her from the dance floor. "We should mingle more," he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. "The night's not over yet." Sarah nodded, taking his arm and preparing to play her role again. But as they moved through the crowd, she couldn't shake the memory of how it felt to be in his arms, or the growing suspicion that she was no longer entirely sure what was real and what was pretend. Behind them, Victoria Hammond watched with narrowed eyes, her red lacquered fingers tightening around her champagne glass. The night might be far from over, but the real games were just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential suite, finding Sarah curled up in an oversized armchair, her phone pressed to her ear. "And you're sure he's okay, Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Tommy is fine, mijita," the elderly woman assured her. "He won first place in the science fair yesterday with his solar system model. He misses you, but he understands you're away for work training." Sarah's heart clenched. Another lie, another moment of her son's life missed. "Tell him I'm so proud of him. I'll make it up to him when I get back." After ending the call, Sarah remained in the chair, watching the city come alive below. The previous night's gala had gone well, surprisingly well, according to Alex's brief assessment, before he'd retreated to the suite's second bedroom. They'd convinced the Hansons, charmed the other guests, and successfully navigated Victoria's attempted sabotage. So why did she feel so unsettled? The sound of a door opening drew her attention. Alex emerged from his room, already impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent. He paused when he saw her, his expression unreadable. "You're up early," he commented, moving to pour himself coffee from the elaborate machine that Sarah hadn't dared touch. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too many thoughts." He studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "About last night?" "About everything." Sarah stood, wrapping her borrowed silk robe more tightly around herself. "The Hansons didn't believe your story about Tommy being my nephew." "No, they didn't," Alex agreed, surprising her with his honesty. "But they believed something more important. They believed in our connection." Our connection. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to address. Sarah thought about their dance, about the moment when pretense had slipped away and something else had taken its place. "Victoria will be a problem," she said instead, changing the subject. "She knows you're hiding something." Alex's expression hardened. "Victoria has always enjoyed creating problems. It's what ended our engagement." He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "But she's not your concern. Focus on the next few days. We have lunch with the Hansons' daughter today and then the opera tomorrow night." "Are you going to tell me what really happened with Victoria?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "If I'm supposed to convince everyone we're in love, shouldn't I know why your last relationship failed?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he walked to the windows, his back to her. Victoria wanted the idea of me more than the reality. She liked the power, the social status, the media attention. When I suggested keeping our engagement private, she leaked it to the press instead. Then she tried to rush the wedding, pushing for a huge public spectacle. "And that's why you ended it?" "No." He turned to face her, his eyes darker than usual. "I ended it because I found out she'd been feeding information about my business dealings to a competitor. The public romance was just a cover to gain access to my company's plans." Sarah absorbed this, understanding why he'd been so insistent on finding someone outside his social circle for this arrangement. "You don't trust easily." "I don't trust at all," he corrected. "This is business, Sarah, a transaction, don't forget that." But there was something in his voice, a slight catch that made her wonder if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. "The car will be here in an hour," he said, checking the message. "Diana left everything you need for lunch in the closet, the pink Chanel suit, if I remember correctly." Sarah nodded, recognizing the dismissal in his tone. As she turned toward her room, his voice stopped her. "Sarah," she looked back at him, "what you did last night with Victoria. Thank you." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. "You don't have to thank me. It's what you're paying me for. Right?" Something flickered across his face, frustration, regret, but it was gone too quickly to interpret. "Right, of course." In her room, Sarah found the pink suit hanging ready, along with all the necessary accessories. Diana had thought of everything, down to the exact shade of lipstick to match the outfit. As she prepared for another day of pretense, Sarah couldn't help wondering about the man in the other room, the man who claimed not to trust anyone, but had chosen to trust her with his reputation and his future. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez, including a photo of Tommy proudly holding his science fair trophy. Sarah stared at her son's beaming face, reminding herself why she was doing this. This was about securing his future, nothing more. She couldn't afford to let complex emotions or midnight dances complicate what was, as Alex had so clearly reminded her, just business. But as she applied her makeup with the practiced precision Diana had taught her, Sarah couldn't quite silence the small voice in her head that wondered if either of them really believed that anymore. The restaurant was exactly what Sarah had expected from the Hansons, old-world elegant, with crisp white tablecloths and waiters who moved like choreographed. Dancers. Emily Hanson, Margaret and Robert's daughter, was already waiting when they arrived, her designer dress and perfect posture making Sarah grateful for Diana's extensive coaching. "Sarah, Alexander," Emily stood to greet them, her smile genuine and warm. "I've been so looking forward to this lunch. Father hasn't stopped talking about you since the gala." Alex's hand found its familiar place on Sarah's lower back as they sat down. "Your father's approval means a lot to us," he said smoothly, "as does yours, Emily." Emily waved off his comment with a grace that spoke of years of social training. "Please, let's skip the business pleasantries. I'm much more interested in getting to know my future friend. After all, once the merger goes through, we'll be seeing, say, a lot of each other at board functions." Sarah felt Alex tense slightly beside her. This wasn't part of the plan. Emily wasn't supposed to be this interested in forming a lasting connection. "That's very kind," Sarah began, but Emily cut her off with a conspiratorial lean forward. "I should warn you, Victoria's already started her whisper campaign. Nothing direct, of course, just little hints about the suddenness of your marriage and your mysterious background." Emily's eyes sparkled with amusement. "She tried the same thing when I married Charles, you know. Some people just can't stand to see others happy." Sarah blinked, surprised by this unexpected alliance. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Oh, don't be. Victoria did me a favor, really. Nothing brings a couple closer than having a common enemy." Emily sipped her water, studying them over the rim of her glass. "Though I must say, you two hardly need the help. The way you look at each other, it's exactly how Charles and I were, in our early days." Alex's hand found Sarah's under the table, squeezing gently. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a loving gesture. Only Sarah felt the slight tremor in his fingers. "Speaking of early days," Emily continued, "you must tell me how you met. Mother says it was at a charity event, but she couldn't remember which one." Sarah felt panic rising. They hadn't prepared for this level of detail, but before she could stumble, Alex jumped in. "It wasn't actually at the event," he said, his voice taking on a softness that Sarah had never heard before. "It was the morning after, at a small diner near my office. I was with a particularly difficult client who was being less than kind to our waitress." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized he was telling the true story of their first meeting, just set 6 months earlier. "Sarah handled him with such grace and dignity," Alex continued, his thumb unconsciously stroking Sarah's palm. "I found myself going back to that diner every morning, always requesting her section. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to ask her out." Emily pressed a hand to her heart. "That's absolutely lovely. And so, unlike your usual decisive business approach, Alexander, love really does change us, doesn't it?" Sarah turned to look at Alex, finding him already watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. For a moment, she could almost believe they were really in love, that this wasn't all an elaborate charade. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of comfortable conversation. Emily proved to be a natural ally, sharing stories about her own integration into high society and offering genuine friendship. By the time they said goodbye, Sarah found herself actually looking forward to seeing her again. "That went well," Alex said as they settled into the back of his car. "Emily's support will go a long way with the board." Sarah nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "Why did you tell the real story about how we met?" "The best lies contain elements of truth," he replied, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "It makes them easier to remember, more convincing." "Is that the only reason?" The question hung between them as the car navigated through city traffic. Finally, Alex turned to her, his expression guarded. "You should rest before the opera tomorrow. The media will be there, and Victoria's Whisper campaign will probably be in full swing." Sarah recognized the deflection, but didn't push. Instead, she found herself thinking about Emily's words about Victoria and common enemies bringing couples closer. She and Alex weren't really a couple, of course, but they were in this together. Whatever happened, they would need to trust each other. As if reading her thoughts, Alex spoke again, his voice quiet. "Emily was right about one thing. Victoria won't stop. She's used to getting what she wants. And right now, what she wants is to expose us." "Let her try," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "We've convinced everyone so far." Alex's lips curved in a slight smile. "We have, haven't we? You're surprisingly good at this. Maybe I'm just good at being your wife." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Sarah immediately wished she could take them back. Alex's expression shifted, becoming unreadable again. "Maybe you are," he said softly, and turned to look out the window. The rest of the ride passed in silence, but Sarah could feel something had changed. The lines between real and pretend were becoming increasingly blurred, and she wasn't sure if either of them knew how to redraw them anymore. The opera house glowed like a jewel against the night sky, its grand entrance crowded with photographers and society reporters. Sarah stood before the mirror in the presidential suite, barely recognizing herself in the midnight blue gown that Diana had selected. The dress seemed to catch every light, making her skin glow and her eyes sparkle. "You look perfect," Diana said, making final adjustments to Sarah's hair. "Remember, tonight is crucial. The media will be watching your every move, analyzing every gesture between you and Alexander." Sarah nodded, trying to calm her nerves. "Victoria will be there." "Yes, and she'll likely try something, but you've handled her beautifully so far." Diana stepped back, satisfied with her work. "Just stay close to Alexander and remember what to." "We practiced." The door opened and Alex stepped in, stopping abruptly when he saw Sarah. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, revealing something raw and genuine in his expression. "Sarah, you—" He cleared his throat. "You look stunning." Before she could respond, he crossed the room and opened a velvet box she hadn't noticed him carrying. Inside was a diamond necklace that caught the light like captured stars. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly, lifting it from the box. "She wore it to her first opera as a married woman. It seemed appropriate." Sarah's breath caught as he moved behind her. In the mirror, she watched him carefully drape the necklace around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin as he fastened the clasp. The intimacy of the moment felt too real, too far from their carefully scripted interactions. "Alex," she whispered, but he stepped back quickly, his mask slipping back into place. "The car's waiting," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The ride to the opera house was silent, filled with intention that neither of them seemed willing to address. As they approached the entrance, Sarah could see the flash of cameras already going off. "Ready?" Alex asked, his hand covering hers. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering everything Diana had taught her. "Ready." The moment they stepped out of the car, the world exploded into a chaos of flashing lights and shouted questions. Alex guided her through it all with practiced ease, his hand steady on her back, stopping occasionally to pose for photos or answer brief questions. "Mr. Blackwood, is it true you're closing the merger with Hanson Industries?" "Mrs. Blackwood, how did you meet?" Over here, please, give us a smile. They were nearly at the entrance when a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Alexander, Sarah, what a delightful surprise. Victoria Hammond emerged from the crowd like a vision in emerald green, a reporter from the city's most prominent society magazine at her side. Sarah felt Alex's hand tighten on her waist. I was just telling Regina here about our long history, Victoria continued, her smile sharp as a blade. She's doing a piece on power couples in the business world. Isn't that fascinating? The reporter's eyes lit up with predatory interest. Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps you could comment on how you've adjusted to life in the spotlight. It must be quite a change from your previous circumstances. Sarah felt every eye on her, waiting for her to stumble. She thought of Tommy, of his proud smile when he won the science fair, of his resilience in the face of every challenge. Drawing strength from that image, she met Victoria's gaze steadily. Life brings us unexpected gifts, she said, letting genuine warmth fill her voice. I never dreamed of spotlights or society events. What drew me to Alex was his heart, the way he cares for his employees, his dedication to charitable causes, his quiet strength. The rest is just... She waved her hand at the glamorous chaos around them. Window dressing. She felt Alex's sharp intake of breath beside her. The reporter was scribbling frantically, clearly delighted with this soundbite. But it was Victoria's expression that told Sarah she'd scored a direct hit. The other woman's perfect smile had frozen in place. How romantic, Victoria managed. Though I must say, Alexander was never one for public displays of affection during our time together. Without missing a beat, Alex turned to Sarah, his eyes intense. The right person changes everything, he said, and then he kissed her. It wasn't the careful, staged kiss they'd practiced for public appearances. This was something else entirely, tender and passionate at the same time, his hand cradling her face as if she were something precious. Sarah found herself responding instinctively, her fingers curling into his lapel, forgetting about the cameras and the crowds and everything, except the feel of his lips on hers. When they finally broke apart, the photographers were having a field day and Victoria had disappeared into the crowd. The reporter was beaming, clearly knowing she had just gotten the story of the month. Shall we? Alex murmured, his voice slightly unsteady as he guided her toward the entrance. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her lips still tingled from the kiss, and her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with their public performance. As they took their seats in the private box, the opening notes of the opera beginning to fill the air, she couldn't help wondering what had just happened. Had it been just another brilliant move in their elaborate game of pretense, or had something real slipped through the cracks in their carefully constructed facade? Looking at Alex's profile in the dimmed light, his expression more unguarded than she'd ever seen it, Sarah realized she was afraid to know the answer. The opera was beautiful, but Sarah barely registered the performance. Her mind kept returning to that kiss, to the way Alex's expression had changed when he first saw her in the gown, to the weight of his grandmother's necklace against her skin. None of it felt like pretense anymore, and that terrified her. They maintained their perfect facade through the intermission, making small talk with board members and accepting compliments on their obvious devotion to each other. But there was a new tension between them, an awareness that hadn't existed before. It was past midnight when they finally returned to the suite. Sarah's feet ached from the designer heels, and her head spun with questions she didn't dare ask. She moved to her room automatically, but Alex's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said softly. "We should talk." Sarah turned to face him, watching as he loosened his bow tie with uncharacteristically uncertain movements. About the kiss? About all of it. He walked to the bar and poured 2 glasses of wine, offering one to her. "What you said to the reporter. About my heart. About caring for my employees. How did you know about that?" Sarah accepted the wine, grateful for something to do with her hands. "I've been watching you. Not just these past few days, but since that morning in the diner. The way you treat service staff when you think no one's looking. The quiet donations to employee emergency funds that never make the news. You try so hard to seem cold, but you're not very good at it. A surprised laugh escaped him. No one's ever accused me of not being cold enough before. Maybe no one's really been looking. Sarah took a sip of wine, gathering her courage. Why did you really choose me, Alex? There must have been dozens of women who would have jumped at this arrangement. He was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. That morning in the diner, when Richard was being impossible, you had this look in your eyes. Not anger or submission, but dignity, strength. I knew then that you were different. Different how? Real, he said simply. In my world, everything is calculated, every gesture measured for its potential benefit. But you're authentically yourself, even when playing this role. It's... He paused, searching for the right word. Refreshing. Sarah moved to the window, needing some distance from his intense gaze. The city stretched out below them, a tapestry of lights and shadows. This isn't real, though, any of it. In 3 days I'll go back to my real life, and you'll close your merger, and all of this will be just a strange dream. She heard him, set down his glass, felt him move to stand behind her. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter, she whispered. That was the deal, remember? No emotional involvement, just business. His hand touched her shoulder, gentle but insistent, turning her to face him. And if I told you the deal had changed? Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. Alex, I can't stop thinking about your son, he continued, surprising her, about how proud you were when you talked about his science fair project, about how much you've sacrificed for him. It makes me wonder what kind of father I might have been if I hadn't convinced myself that love was a liability. Don't, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Don't say things like that unless you mean them. Tommy's been disappointed by enough people in his life. I do mean it. His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. I mean all of it. Tonight, when I kissed you, that wasn't for... The cameras, I think you know that. Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his confession. This is crazy. We barely know each other. Don't we? His thumb traced her cheekbone gently. You know me better than Victoria ever did. Better than anyone has in a very long time. A knock at the door shattered the moment. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers as Diana's voice called through the door. Alexander, we have a situation. Victoria's given an interview to the Daily Mirror. They're running it in the morning edition. Sarah watched the transformation as Alex's professional mask slipped back into place. He stepped away from her, already reaching for his phone. Send me the advance copy. I'll call our PR team. But before he opened the door, he turned back to Sarah. This conversation isn't over. She nodded, unable to find words. After he left, she stood alone in the darkened room, her fingers touching the diamonds at her throat. The necklace felt heavier now, weighted with meaning and memory and possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. Her phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Rodriguez with a photo of Tommy sleeping, surrounded by books and star charts. The sight brought tears to her eyes. Everything had seemed so simple when this started. Pretend to be in love, get the money, secure her son's future. Now nothing was simple anymore. Because somewhere between the practiced smiles and rehearsed touches, between the public performances and private moments, something real had begun to grow. And Sarah wasn't sure if that something was beautiful, or dangerous, or both. Sarah woke to the sound of urgent voices in the suite's living room. Sunlight was just beginning to creep through the windows as she pulled on her robe and opened her door, finding Alex in an intense discussion with Diana and a sharp-suited woman she didn't recognize. The timing is deliberate, the unknown woman was saying, gesturing at a tablet. Victoria waited until the photos from the opera hit the morning news. The contrast between your public display of affection and her insider revelations creates maximum impact. What exactly did she say? Sarah asked, making her presence known. All three turned to look at her. Alex's expression softened momentarily before returning to its business-like mask. Sarah, this is Jessica Chen, our head of PR. She's handling Victoria's interview, which you need to read, Diana said, handing Sarah the tablet. The article was worse than she'd expected. Victoria hadn't made any direct accusations, but her implications were crystal clear. She spoke about Alexander's pattern of using relationships for business advantages, his mysterious new wife appearing just as the Hansen merger was being negotiated, and her own concerns about his true intentions. "She's painted me as a victim of your manipulation," Sarah said quietly, looking at Alex, and herself as the concerned ex who sees history repeating itself. "It's clever," Jessica admitted. "She's positioned herself as looking out for your interests while simultaneously undermining your relationship's credibility. The society papers are already running with it." Alex ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "The Hansens?" "Robert called first thing this morning," Diana reported. "He wants to move up your dinner with them to tonight. Says there are matters to discuss." Sarah's stomach clenched. Everything they'd worked for was threatening to unravel. "What do we do?" "We fight back," Jessica said firmly. "I've already arranged a breakfast interview with Regina from Society Weekly, the same reporter from the opera. She's sympathetic. To your side after last night's display. We counter Victoria's insinuations with your real love story." "Our real love story," Sarah repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She thought of their conversation last night, of the truths and almost truths they'd shared before Victoria's latest attack had interrupted them. Alex must have heard something in her voice because he turned to Diana and Jessica. "Give us a moment, please." Once they were alone, he approached Sarah slowly, as if afraid she might bolt. "I meant what I said last night, all of it." "Did you?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Or were you just getting caught up in the role like Victoria claims you always do? You know me better than that." "Do I?" She gestured at the tablet. "Victoria knew you for years, and look how that turned out. I've known you for less than a week. And in that week, you've seen more of the real me than Victoria ever did." He reached for her hand, and Sarah let him take it, trying to ignore how natural it felt. "Last night, when you spoke to that reporter about my heart, about the things I try to hide, you weren't acting, and neither was I when I kissed you." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the kiss, the way it had felt like falling and flying at the same time. "Alex, please, we can't do this now. The Hansens, the merger, your company's future. It's all at risk." "Look at me," he said softly. And when she did, the intensity in his eyes took her breath away. "The merger isn't the most important thing at risk here." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. The spell broke as he checked the message, his expression darkening. "Richard wants an emergency board meeting. Apparently, some of the members have concerns about my judgment." "Your business partner from the diner?" Sarah asked, remembering the rude man who'd started all of this. "He's never approved of the Hansen merger. He thinks we should break up the company and sell it off piece by piece for maximum profit." Alex's jaw tightened. Victoria's article just gave him the ammunition he needed to challenge my leadership. Sarah felt a fresh wave of guilt. "This is all because of me?" "No," Alex said firmly. "This is because I've spent years cultivating an image of being cold and calculating, because I convinced everyone, including myself, that emotions were a weakness in business. Victoria isn't attacking you, she's attacking the cracks she sees in my armor." "And am I?" Sarah asked quietly. "A crack in your armor." He touched her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a now familiar gesture. "You're the first real thing in my life in a very long time." The moment stretched between them, full of possibilities and dangers. Then Diana's voice called through the door again, reminding them of the waiting reporter downstairs. "We should get ready," Sarah said, stepping back reluctantly. "We have a love story to sell." Alex caught her hand before she could turn away. "Not sell, tell. For the first time since this started, maybe we can tell the truth." "Which truth?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. "The one where you hired me to play a role? Or the one where we're both starting to wish the role was real?" He didn't answer, but his eyes said everything his voice didn't. Sarah withdrew her hand gently and went to get ready, her mind spinning with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider before. Victoria's attack might have been meant to destroy them, But perhaps it had done something else entirely, forced them to confront the reality growing beneath their carefully constructed illusion. The question was, would that reality survive the challenges coming their way? The interview with Regina went better than anyone could have hoped. Sarah spoke from the heart about falling in love with the man behind the corporate mask, while Alex revealed a softer side that had the reporter practically swooning. They didn't have to pretend or follow a script. They simply told the truth about how they saw each other, leaving out only the circumstance of their initial arrangement. But as they prepared for dinner with the Hansons, Sarah couldn't shake her unease. Alex had been in board meetings all afternoon, leaving her alone with her thoughts and Diana's endless coaching. The black dress, Diana decided, pulling it from the closet. Classic, elegant, but not trying too hard. We want you to look confident, not defensive. Sarah nodded absently, her mind on the way Alex had looked at her that morning, the way his touch had lingered even during their practiced poses for the interview. Everything was changing, evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. A knock at the door made them both turn. Alex entered, looking tired but determined. "Diana, give us a moment." Once they were alone, he crossed to where Sarah stood by the window. The board meeting was challenging. Richard is pushing for a vote of no confidence. Can he do that? He needs a majority, which he doesn't have yet, but he's using Victoria's article to paint me as emotionally compromised. Alex's laugh was bitter. The irony is, he might be right. Sarah's heart skipped. What do you mean? I've spent the whole day defending my decisions, our relationship, the merger, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to be back here with you. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up its perfect style. I'm not pretending anymore, Sarah. I don't think I have been for days. She reached up to smooth his hair, back into place, the gesture startlingly intimate. Alex, wait. He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. Let me finish. If Richard succeeds, if the merger falls through, I'll lose control of the company I built. Everything I've worked for could disappear. And the strangest part is, I'm not sure I care. You don't mean that. I do. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For years, I thought success meant closing deals, acquiring companies, growing profits. But watching you with Tommy's photo, seeing how you light up when you talk about his science projects, it's made me realize how empty my definition of success has been. Sarah felt tears threatening. Don't say things like that when we're about to have dinner with the Hansons, when everything's falling apart. That's exactly why I need to say it. He pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. Because if everything falls apart, I need you to know that you're not just part of a business deal to me anymore. You're... A sharp knock interrupted them. Mr. Blackwood, the car is ready, Diana's voice called. They broke apart slowly, reality crashing back in. Sarah wiped her eyes carefully, grateful for waterproof mascara. We should go. Sarah, Alex's voice stopped her at the door. Whatever happens tonight, remember what I said. Remember what's real. The drive to the Hansons' mansion was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Sarah's hand found Alex's halfway there, their fingers intertwining naturally. Whether it was for comfort or courage, neither of them seemed sure. As they pulled up to the imposing house, Sarah spotted another familiar car. Is that Victoria's car? Alex confirmed grimly. It seems the Hansons want all sides of the story. Sarah squeezed his hand. Then let's give them the truth. Which truth? He asked, echoing her question from that morning. She turned to face him, her heart racing but her voice steady. The truth about how you're changing, about how we both are, about how sometimes the most real things start from the most unlikely beginnings. For a moment, they just looked at each other, understanding passing between them. Then, Alex leaned in and kissed her softly, not for cameras or reporters or social expectations, but simply because he wanted to. When they pulled apart, Sarah saw something new in his eyes, not just passion or confusion or growing feelings, but determination. Whatever happened inside that house, whatever Victoria had planned, they would face it together. As they walked to the door, Sarah thought about Tommy, about the lesson she taught him about standing up for what you believe in. Tonight, she would stand up for this unexpected thing growing between her and Alex, this real unscripted love that had somehow bloomed in the midst of their careful pretense. The door opened, spilling warm light onto the steps. Sarah took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to fight for something she'd never expected to find. A future that had nothing to do with business deals and everything to do with the way Alex's hand felt in hers. The Hansons' dining room was a study in old-world elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the antique mahogany table. Sarah sat beside Alex, acutely aware of Victoria's presence across from them. Margaret and Robert Hanson occupied the head and foot of the table, while Emily and her husband Charles filled out the remaining seats. "I must say," Margaret began as the first course was served, "Victoria's article raised some interesting points about the timing of your relationship." Sarah felt Alex tense beside her, but kept her own expression calm. "Timing can be a funny thing, Mrs. Hanson. Sometimes life brings us exactly what we need, precisely when we need it. Or precisely when it's most advantageous," Victoria interjected smoothly, sipping her wine. "Alexander has always had impeccable timing when it comes to business opportunities." Emily shot Victoria a sharp look. "I thought we were here to discuss the merger, not dredge up ancient history." "The personal and the professional are often intertwined," Robert Hanson said, his eyes fixed on Alex, "especially in family businesses. We need to know that our potential partners share our values." "And you believe Victoria's implications about my values?" Alex's voice was controlled, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "We believe in doing our due diligence," Margaret replied. "When someone who knew you as well as Victoria did raises concerns—" "Did she know me?" Alex interrupted, surprising everyone with his directness. "Did anyone before Sarah?" Victoria's perfect smile faltered slightly. "Darling, we were engaged. Of course I knew you." "You knew what I wanted you to know," Alex said quietly. "You knew the corporate raider, the cold businessman, the carefully constructed image, just like you knew exactly when to sell my company's confidential information to our competitors." A heavy silence fell over the table. Victoria's face went pale while the Hansons exchanged startled looks. "Is this true?" Robert asked, looking between them. "Ask your friend Richard Thompson," Alex suggested. "He was the one buying the information. That's why he's so desperate to stop this merger. He knows I have proof of their conspiracy." Sarah watched understanding dawn on the Hansons' faces. Victoria's carefully crafted narrative was unraveling, but she wasn't done yet. "At least I was honest about who I was," Victoria snapped, her composure cracking. "Unlike your new wife here. Have you told the Hansons about her son? About her 2 jobs? About how you met her serving coffee?" Instead of the bombshell Victoria clearly expected, Emily laughed. "You mean the nephew she's raising, the one Alexander told us about at the gala? And yes, we know they met at a diner. It's quite a romantic story, actually." Victoria turned to Sarah, her eyes blazing. "Nephew? Is that what you're calling him now? Are you so ashamed of your past that you deny your own child?" Sarah felt something snap inside her. All the fear, all the pretense, all the careful navigation of social expectations. It fell away, leaving only truth. "I have never been ashamed of my son," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Tommy is the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes, I worked 2 jobs to support him. Yes, I served coffee and sold cosmetics and did whatever I had to do to give him a good life. And I am proud of that." She turned to the Hansons, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You want to know about values? I value hard work, honesty, and putting family first. I value the way Alex treats his employees, the quiet kindness he shows when he thinks no one is watching, and the man he's becoming when he lets himself be real." Alex's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, drawing strength from his touch. "The truth is, I didn't fall in love with Alexander Blackwood, the CEO. I fell in love with Alex, the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. The man who's learning that real strength isn't about being cold or calculating, but about being brave enough to be vulnerable. Margaret Hanson was watching them with an unreadable expression. And when exactly did this love story begin? Sarah looked at Alex, seeing in his eyes the same realization she'd come to, that the best lies were actually truths. "It began the morning he defended me against a rude customer," she said softly. "But I think we both tried to pretend it wasn't happening. We had our reasons, our fears, our careful plans. But love doesn't follow business strategies or social expectations. It just happens." "Even when you're trying to fight it," Alex added, his voice rough with emotion. "Even when you think you're just playing a role." Robert Hanson set down his wineglass with a decisive click. "Well, that settles it for me." "Settles what?" Victoria demanded, looking increasingly desperate. "The merger, of course," Robert smiled. "We needed to know if Alexander was still the cold corporate raider everyone thought he was. You've actually done us a favor, Victoria. Your article forced the truth into the open." Margaret nodded in agreement. Real love changes people, and clearly it's changed Alexander for the better. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. You're all being fooled by a very clever performance." "The only performance," Emily said quietly, "was your concerned ex-fiancé act. I think it's time for you to leave." As Victoria stormed out, Sarah felt the tension in the room dissipate. But one truth still hung heavy on her heart: the reality of how her feelings for Alex had transformed from pretense to something achingly real. The question was, would that truth be enough for whatever challenges still lay ahead? The ride back to the hotel was filled with a charged silence. Sarah's confession at dinner, both the planned and unplanned parts, had shifted something fundamental between them. Alex hadn't let go of her hand since they left the Hansons' house, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her skin. "Did you mean it?" he finally asked as they entered the suite. "What you said about falling in love with the real me?" Sarah moved to the window, her refuge during difficult conversations. The city lights blurred through unshed tears. "Does it matter? The merger is safe now. Victoria's credibility is destroyed. You've won." "Sarah," his voice was closer now, right behind her. "Look at me." She turned, finding him closer than expected. The carefully maintained distance between them had evaporated, leaving only the truth they'd been dancing around for days. "Of course it matters," he said softly. "Everything about you matters." "Alex, please, we can't what, be honest, feel what we're feeling." He touched her face gently. "You said I was learning to be vulnerable. Well, here's vulnerability for you. I'm terrified of how much I need you." Sarah's breath caught. "The contract." "Forget the contract. Forget the merger. Forget Victoria. Forget everything except this moment." His eyes held hers intently. "Tell me again what you told the Hansons, but this time just for me." She could feel her walls crumbling, the careful boundaries she'd built around her heart dissolving under his gaze. "I meant every word. About your kindness, your heart, the way you're changing. About falling in love with the real you." Even though it wasn't part of the plan. Especially because it wasn't part of the plan. She laughed softly, the sound half-sob. "Do you know what scares me most? In less than 3 days, this all ends. I go back to my life, you go back to yours, and this becomes just another business transaction." Alex's hands framed her face, his touch achingly gentle. "What if it doesn't have to end?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if this wasn't just a week-long arrangement? What if it could be real, you, me, Tommy building something genuine together?" The hope in his voice made her heart ache. "Alex, our worlds are too different. You saw how Victoria used my background against us. The board already thinks you're emotionally compromised, and Tommy, I can't let him get attached to someone who might not stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, unless you don't want this to be real, unless I'm reading everything wrong and your feelings really were just part of the act." Sarah looked up at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and made a decision. Standing on tiptoe, she kissed him, not the passionate public kiss from the opera, but something softer, more intimate, filled with all the things she couldn't say. When they broke apart, Alex rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered, "not because of a contract or a business deal. Stay because what we've found is real." "It won't be easy," she warned. "The press will dig into my past, the board will question your judgment, and Tommy will have two people who love him instead of one," Alex finished, "and we'll face everything else together." A knock at the door made them jump apart. Again. This time it was Jessica, the PR manager, with urgent news about Richard's next move against the merger. "We should deal with this," Sarah said, reluctantly stepping back. Alex caught her hand. "We will, but first, are we doing this, really doing this?" Sarah thought about all the twists that had led them here, about how something that started as pretense had transformed into the most real thing she'd ever felt. "Yes," she said softly, "we're doing this." His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then they turned to face whatever challenges awaited them, their hands still linked, their hearts finally in sync. But as they listened to Jessica's report, Sarah couldn't help wondering if love, even real, unexpected, transformative love, would be enough to overcome the obstacles still standing in their way. Richard's opposition, the board's doubts, the press's scrutiny, and their own fears were still very real threats to their newfound happiness. Yet somehow, with Alex's hand warm in hers and his promise of forever echoing in her heart, those obstacles seemed less insurmountable than before. Sarah woke to the sound of Alex's voice, tense and controlled, coming from the suite's living room. She slipped on her robe and quietly opened her door, finding him pacing as he spoke on the phone. "I don't care how you do it, just get me those documents," he was saying. "Richard's not going to get away with this." He noticed her, and his expression softened momentarily before returning to its serious cast. "Yes, immediately. And Jessica, make sure the board receives copies as soon as you have them." "What's happening?" Sarah asked after he ended the call. Alex ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Richard's made his move. He's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's presenting evidence that I've been using company resources for personal matters, the arrangements for our marriage. Among other things," he walked to the window, his posture tense. "He's also claiming I've been hiding losses in our Asian markets, making the company look more attractive to the Hansons than it really is." Sarah moved to stand beside him, but that's not true. "Of course not. The Asian division is actually outperforming projections, but Richard's manufactured some very convincing documents." Alex turned to face her. He's desperate to stop this merger. He knows once it's complete, his connection to Victoria and the information leaks will come to light. Sarah touched his arm gently. "What can I do?" His expression softened as he looked at her. "You've already done more than enough. Last night at the Hansons, the way you spoke about us, about me, it was everything. I meant every word." "I know." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "That's what scares me. You and Tommy. You've become so important to me. The thought of losing everything I've built, of not being able to give you the life you deserve." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Alex, stop. I didn't fall in love with your company or your money. I fell in love with you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, but before it could deepen, his phone buzzed again. Sarah stepped back, letting him answer it. "What?" His expression darkened as he listened. "When?" "No, don't let them run it. I don't care what it costs. Buy every copy if you have to." After he hung up, he turned to Sarah with a grim expression. "Richard's gone to the tabloids. They're running a story about Tommy." Sarah's heart stopped. "What about Tommy?" "They've discovered he's not your nephew. They're painting you as a gold digger who used her illegitimate child to trap me." He reached for her hand. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never wanted Tommy dragged into this." She pulled away, panic rising in her chest. "I need to call Mrs. Rodriguez. If reporters start showing up at the apartment..." "Already taken care of. I have security watching the building, and Emily Hansen offered to let Mrs. Rodriguez and Tommy stay at their guest house until this blows over." He caught her hands again. "But there's something else we need to discuss." The gravity in his voice made her stomach clench. What? The board meeting is tomorrow morning. If it goes badly, things could get ugly very quickly. The press will be relentless, the scrutiny intense. He took a deep breath. I think you and Tommy should go stay with the Hansons until it's over. No, the word came out sharp and firm. I'm not running away, and I'm not hiding my son. Sarah, please, think about Tommy. I am thinking about Tommy. She squared her shoulders. All his life I've taught him to be proud of who he is, to stand up for what he believes in. What kind of message would I send by hiding him now? Alex studied her face. You really aren't afraid, are you? Terrified, she admitted, but not of what people might say about me. I'm afraid of teaching my son that love is something to be ashamed of. Something shifted in Alex's expression. You're extraordinary, you know that? I'm just a mother protecting her child. She touched his face gently. And a woman protecting the man she loves. His phone buzzed again, but this time he ignored it, pulling her close instead. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. No more hiding, no more shame. No more pretending, she added softly. They stood there, holding each other as the morning sun streamed through the windows, both knowing that the real storm was still to come. The board meeting loomed ahead. Richard's accusations hung over them, and somewhere in the city Tommy was probably wondering why he couldn't go home. But for this moment, in the quiet of the morning, they drew strength from each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as part of a business arrangement, but as partners in something far more precious and real. Sarah thought about Tommy, about his resilience and his unwavering belief in the good in people. She thought about Alex, about how he was willing to risk everything he'd built to stand beside her, and she realized that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply let yourself be loved, completely and without reservation. The storm was coming, but they were ready, together. The day passed in a blur of phone calls, strategy meetings, and preparations for the board meeting. Sarah insisted on being involved in everything, absorbing information about Alex's company and the intricacies of corporate politics. If they were going to fight this battle, she wanted to understand exactly what they were fighting for. Late. In the afternoon, Emily Hanson called with an update about Tommy. He's having the time of his life, she reported. Charles has been showing him the telescope in our observatory. I think you might have a future astronomer on your hands. The news brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Thank you, Emily, for everything. That's what family does, Emily replied simply. And speaking of family, Father wants you both to know that the merger agreement stands, regardless of tomorrow's outcome. He says he's investing in the man Alex is becoming, not just his company. After the call, Sarah found Alex in his makeshift office, surrounded by documents and looking exhausted. When was the last time you ate? He glanced up, a soft smile, breaking through his worried expression. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. She perched on the edge of his desk. The Hansons are still with us. Emily just called. I heard. He took her hand, playing with her fingers absently. Robert Hanson is a better man than I deserve. He sees what I see, the good man behind the corporate mask. She squeezed his hand. Now, about that food. Knock interrupted them. Diana entered, looking uncharacteristically excited. We found it. Alex sat up straighter. The proof? Diana handed him a folder. Everything. The money trail linking Richard to Victoria, the fake documents about the Asian markets, even emails discussing their plan to manipulate the board. Sarah watched Alex's expression change as he read, determination replacing exhaustion. This changes everything. There's more, Diana continued. Jessica's team discovered that Richard has been secretly meeting with our biggest competitors. He's been promising them pieces of the company after he takes control. Classic corporate raider tactics, Alex said grimly. He accused me of being cold and calculating while planning to dismantle everything we've built. Sarah studied the documents over his shoulder. Can you use this at the board meeting? Better. A familiar glint of strategic brilliance lit his eyes. We can use it before the meeting. Diana, call Jessica. I want these documents sent to every board member tonight with a personal note from me." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked after. Diana left. "Richard's whole strategy relies on painting me as emotionally compromised, too focused on personal matters to lead the company." Alex stood, energy radiating from him. "But these documents prove he's the one letting personal grudges and greed drive his decisions. And the board will see that. They'll have to." He pulled her to her feet into his arms. "You know what this means. Even if we win tomorrow, things will change. The company will need rebuilding. Trust will need to be restored. It won't be easy." Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck. "Good thing you're not alone anymore." His expression softened as he looked at her. "I still can't believe this is real sometimes. A week ago, you were just part of a business strategy. Now, you're everything." He touched her face gently. "You and Tommy, you've given me something I never knew I was missing. A reason to be more than just a successful businessman, a chance to be part of a real family." Sarah felt her heart swell. "Speaking of Tommy, Emily says he's discovered their observatory. Apparently he's quite taken with the telescope." Alex's eyes lit up. "Really? You know, I could have one installed at the penthouse. There's a perfect spot on the upper terrace." He trailed off, seeming to realize what he was implying. Sarah held her breath, waiting. "I mean," he continued carefully, "if you both wanted, that is, after all this is over." "Alexander Blackwood," Sarah said, fighting a smile, "are you asking us to move in with you?" "Too soon." She kissed him softly. "Ask me again after tomorrow. After we've won this fight and you've actually met Tommy properly. Ask me when we're not in the middle of a corporate war and tabloid scandal." He rested his forehead against hers. "And when I do. Ask me properly, with no contracts or business strategies involved, and you might just get the answer you're hoping for." His phone buzzed. Jessica confirming that the documents were ready to be sent to the board. The real world was intruding again, reminding them of the battle ahead. But something had changed. The fear and uncertainty of the morning had been replaced by determination and hope. As they reviewed the documents one final time, preparing for tomorrow's confrontation, Sarah realized that this was what real partnership felt like. Not the carefully scripted performance they'd started with, but the genuine support and understanding that had grown between them. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they had each other. They had the truth on their side, and they had a future worth fighting for. It wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd imagined as a girl, but it was better. It was real, complicated, and completely their own. The Blackwood Industries boardroom buzzed with tension as Sarah sat beside Alex, facing the assembled board members. Richard Thompson occupied the opposite end of the long table, his usual arrogance somewhat diminished after the release of the incriminating documents the night before. Still, the smile he directed at them held a trace of smugness that made Sarah uneasy. "Before we begin," Richard said, standing, "I move to have Mrs. Blackwood removed from these proceedings. This is a confidential board matter." "Mrs. Blackwood stays." Robert Hanson's voice came from the doorway as he entered, surprising everyone. "As a major stakeholder in this merger, I have a vested interest in these proceedings, and I specifically requested her presence." Sarah felt Alex's hand squeeze hers under the table as Robert took his seat. The older man's unexpected support gave them both confidence. "Very well," Richard conceded, though his expression darkened. "Then let's address the evidence I've gathered regarding Alexander's questionable judgment." For the next hour, Richard presented his case. He spoke about Alex's emotional instability since meeting Sarah, produced documents suggesting mismanagement of company resources, and painted a picture of a CEO too distracted by personal matters to lead effectively. Finally, he turned to the issue of the Asian markets. "The documents I've provided clearly show that our Eastern division is underperforming. Alexander has been hiding these losses to make the company more attractive to Hanson Industries. This merger is built on deception." Sarah felt Alex tense beside her, but his voice remained calm as he stood. "Interesting theory, Richard, but I think the board should see these first." Jessica distributed new folders to each board member. "These are the real numbers from our Asian division," Alex continued, "along with proof that the documents Richard presented were falsified. You'll also find evidence of his collaboration with Victoria Hammond to sabotage this merger, as well as his secret meetings with our competitors." The room erupted in murmurs as the board members reviewed the new information. Richard's face had gone pale. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "I can't possibly believe. We have the original files," Alex cut in smoothly, "complete with metadata showing when they were altered. We also have witness statements from the IT department about who requested those alterations." "And what about her?" Richard pointed at Sarah, desperation evident in his voice. "Are we just going to ignore the fact that you married a waitress? That she has an illegitimate child? That this whole relationship is clearly a calculated move to appeal to the Hansons' family values?" Sarah stood slowly, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Yes, I was a waitress. I'm also a mother who has worked 2 jobs to support her son. I've never hidden who I am or where I came from. Can you say the same about your dealings with Victoria Hammond?" "The board has copies of your correspondence with Victoria," Alex added, "including the details of how much you paid her for confidential information during our engagement, which, by the way, is why the merger with Carlton Industries fell through 2 years ago." One of the older board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, these allegations are extremely serious. If these documents are authentic—" "They are," Robert Hanson interrupted. "My security team independently verified everything last night. Additionally, we've discovered evidence that Mr. Thompson has been secretly negotiating to sell off divisions of Blackwood Industries to competitors after this attempted takeover." Richard's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. Alexander's vision for this company is too limited. We could be making billions if we what?" Alex's voice was sharp. "If we break apart a company that employs thousands of people? If we sacrifice long-term stability for short-term profits? That's not leadership, Richard. That's greed." Sarah watched the board members' faces, seeing the shift in their expressions as they processed everything. She thought about all the employees whose livelihoods depended on this moment, about the reality of what corporate raiders like Richard could do to communities when they dismantled companies for profit. "I move for an immediate vote, 1 of E," the board members said, "on both the merger and Mr. Thompson's continued position with the company." Richard looked around desperately but found no allies. The evidence was too compelling, his betrayal too complete. As the votes were cast, Sarah felt Alex's hand find hers again. They'd prepared for this moment, but the reality was still breathtaking. One by one, the board members voiced their support for Alex's leadership and the merger with Hanson Industries. Richard's attempt to seize control had failed spectacularly. "One final matter," Alex said after the votes were counted. "Given the evidence of corporate espionage and fraud, I recommend we pursue legal action against both Mr. Thompson and Ms. Hammond." "Agreed," Robert Hanson said firmly. "We'll have our legal teams coordinate." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over, Alexander. You can't—" "Security will escort you out," Alex interrupted calmly. "Your access to the building has already been revoked." As Richard was led away, Sarah felt the tension in the room dissipate. Board members were standing, congratulating Alex and welcoming Robert Hanson's increased involvement. Through it all, Alex kept hold of her hand, anchoring them both in the reality of what they'd accomplished. But it was Robert Hanson's words to her that truly marked the moment. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first heard about Alexander's marriage, I was skeptical. But watching you both today, seeing how you support each other, how you face challenges together, that's what real partnership looks like. That's what our company needs." Sarah smiled, squeezing Alex's hand. "Sometimes the most genuine things come from unexpected beginnings." As the boardroom slowly emptied, Sarah realized that one chapter of their story was ending, but another was just beginning. They'd won the battle, but the real challenge lay ahead, building a life Together, that was as real and strong as the love that had grown between them. The sun was setting over the city as Alex's car pulled up to the Hansons' estate. Sarah's heart raced with anticipation. After the board meeting, after all the legal discussions and press statements, they were finally going to see Tommy. "Nervous?" Alex asked, helping her from the car. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if he's angry that I've been away? What if he doesn't understand? What if—" "Mommy!" Tommy's voice cut through her fears as he burst out of the house, running toward them with his usual boundless energy. Sarah knelt to catch him in a tight hug, breathing in his familiar scent. "I missed you so much, baby." "I'm not a baby anymore," he protested, but hugged her tighter. "Mrs. Hanson let me use their big telescope. I saw Jupiter's moons and everything." Sarah laughed through happy tears, standing with Tommy still in her arms. That's when she noticed him looking curiously at Alex. "Are you my mom's friend?" Tommy asked directly. "The one from the newspapers?" Alex knelt to Tommy's level, his expression softening in a way Sarah had never seen before. "My name is Alex, and yes, I'm your mom's friend. I've heard a lot about you. Emily tells me you're quite the astronomer." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Do you like space too?" "I do. In fact, I was thinking about installing a telescope at my home, but I'd need an expert to help me choose the right one. Someone who really knows their astronomy." Sarah watched as her son launched into an enthusiastic explanation of different telescope types, Alex listening with genuine interest. The scene made her heart swell. This wasn't the rehearsed charm he used in business meetings, but something real and gentle. Emily appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene. "Why don't you all come inside? We've got hot chocolate, and Charles is dying to discuss orbital mechanics with his new protege." As they walked toward the house, Tommy between, to them Sarah felt Alex's hand brush against hers. The gesture was subtle but full of meaning. They were in this together now, for real. Inside, over hot chocolate and astronomy discussions, Sarah watched her two worlds merge. Tommy, usually shy with strangers, was completely at ease with Alex and the Hansons. He showed them his drawings of solar systems, beaming with pride when Alex asked if he could hang one in his office. Later, as Tommy excitedly explored the library with Charles, Emily pulled Sarah aside. "He's a remarkable boy." "Yes, he is." Sarah watched through the doorway as Tommy pointed out constellations in an astronomy book. "I've spent so long trying to protect him, to make sure he never felt the lack of anything. And now? Now I'm realizing that maybe what he needed wasn't protection, but possibility. The chance to dream bigger than I could manage on my own." Emily squeezed her hand. "That's what family is for. And like it or not, you're stuck with us now. All of you." Across the room, Alex caught Sarah's eye and smiled, that real, unguarded smile she'd come to treasure. He was sitting on the floor with Tommy, both of them completely absorbed in building something with Tommy's ever-present science kit. "I never expected any of this," Sarah confessed quietly. "When he first made that business proposal, I thought I was just doing what was necessary to secure Tommy's future. I never imagined that you'd find love, that your son would gain not just a father figure, but an entire extended family who already adores him." Emily smiled. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan for." Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Tommy surprised them all by hugging Alex. "Will you come see the telescope with me again?" Alex knelt down, his expression serious. "Actually, I was hoping maybe you and your mom might want to come stay at my house for a while. I have this terrace that would be perfect for stargazing." Tommy looked at Sarah hopefully. "Can we, Mom?" Sarah met Alex's eyes over their son's head. Yes, their son, because somehow in the space of an evening, that's what he had become. "What do you think, baby? Should we give it a try?" Tommy's enthusiastic response made them all laugh, but it was the look on Alex's face that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Gone was the cold CEO, the strategic businessman. In his place was simply a man in love, not just with her, but with the possibility of the family they could become. As they drove home to Alex's penthouse, which would soon be their home, too, Sarah thought about how much had changed in just 1 week. She'd started out playing a role, pretending to be in love with a man she barely knew. Now here she was, falling more deeply in love with him every day, watching him bond with her son, building a future none of them had expected. "What are you thinking about?" Alex asked, softly, his hand finding hers in the darkness of the car. Sarah looked at Tommy asleep in the back seat, clutching the astronomy book Alex had given him. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from being brave enough to let go of our careful plans." Alex brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you." And there it was. The truth that had been growing between them all along, now spoken freely without contracts or pretense or fear. They had faced down corporate raiders and tabloid scandals, family secrets and social prejudices, and emerged stronger together. The city lights sparkled around them as they drove home, like stars guiding them toward their future. It wasn't the ending either of them had planned for, but it was better. It was real, and it was theirs. A month had passed since the board meeting, and the penthouse had transformed from Alex's pristine bachelor pad into a real home. Tommy's astronomy books and science projects now shared space with business reports, and family photos had replaced abstract art on the walls. Sarah stood on the terrace, watching Alex and Tommy set up the new telescope, a professional-grade model that had Tommy practically bouncing with excitement when it arrived. The evening air was crisp, and the city lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars. "Mom, come look," Tommy called out. "Alex showed me how to find the Andromeda Galaxy." She joined them at the telescope, smiling as Tommy rattled off facts about distant galaxies. Alex stood behind them, one arm around her waist, his expression soft, as he watched Tommy's enthusiasm. "Did you know," Tommy said, looking up from the telescope, "that some stars we see are actually binary systems, two stars orbiting each other, looking like one from Earth?" "Is that so?" Alex asked, though Sarah knew he'd heard this fact at least 3 times since the telescope arrived. "Uh-huh. They're like dance partners, moving together through space." Tommy adjusted the telescope's focus. "Kinda like you and Mom." Sarah felt Alex's arm tighten around her waist. In the month since they'd moved in, Tommy had blossomed. His natural curiosity, always constrained by their limited resources, now had room to grow. Alex had converted one of the spare rooms into a science lab for Tommy's experiments, complete with a digital planetarium projector on the ceiling. "Speaking of dancing," Alex said, "there's something I wanted to discuss with both of you." He led them to the outdoor seating area, where Mrs. Rodriguez had left a plate of her famous cookies. She still watched Tommy occasionally, but now as a beloved grandmother figure rather than out of necessity. The merger with Hansen Industries. "Heirs officially complete," Alex began, "and they're throwing a celebration gala next weekend." Tommy's face fell slightly. "Another fancy party? Will Mrs. Rodriguez make me practice my table manners again?" Alex laughed. "Actually, this time I was hoping you'd be my special guest. The Hansens are unveiling a new educational initiative, a scholarship program for young scientists, and they want you to help present it." Tommy's eyes widened. "Me? Really?" "Really," Sarah confirmed, having already discussed this with Emily. "They want to name it the Tommy Miller Young Astronomer Fellowship." "But I'm just a kid," Tommy protested, though his excitement was visible. Alex knelt in front of him. "You're the inspiration for the whole program. Your passion for science, your determination to learn despite obstacles, that's exactly what this fellowship is about. We want to help other kids like you reach for the stars." Tommy launched himself at Alex in a tight hug, then pulled back with a serious expression. "Will I have to wear a tie?" "Afraid so, buddy." Alex ruffled his hair. "But I thought maybe tomorrow we could go shopping for it together. Man to man." The phrase made Tommy sit up straighter, proud to be included in such grown-up plans. "Can we get a bow tie? Like the one in the picture of you and Mom at the opera?" "Whatever you want." Alex's voice was slightly rough with emotion. "And after shopping, I thought we might stop by the courthouse." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She and Alex had discussed this, but she hadn't known he was planning to bring it up tonight. Tommy looked confused. The courthouse? Why? Alex took Sarah's hand, drawing her closer. Well, I was hoping to talk to a judge about making our family official, about adopting you, if that's something you'd want. The silence that followed felt endless. Tommy looked between them, his young mind processing this momentous possibility. You mean you'd really be my dad? Legally and everything? If you want me to be, Alex said softly. I love you and your mum more than anything. You've taught me what really matters in life. Not business deals or corporate mergers, but family, love, and the courage to dream big. Tommy was quiet for another moment, then asked, would I have to call you Dad right away? Could I work? Up to it? Sarah felt tears in her eyes as Alex answered, you can call me whatever makes you comfortable. The name isn't what matters. What matters is that we're family, in our hearts and on paper. Tommy nodded solemnly. I think I'd like that. But can we still do science experiments and look at stars together? Every chance we get, Alex promised, his own eyes suspiciously bright. In fact, I have another surprise for after the gala. How would you like to visit the Kennedy Space Center? They have a special program for young astronomers, and I hear the head of their education department is very interested in meeting you. As Tommy exploded with excitement, peppering Alex with questions about rockets and astronaut training, Sarah watched them together. She thought about that first morning in the diner, about the contract that had seemed so straightforward, about all the unexpected turns that had led them here. The evening grew cooler, and Alex wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, a gesture that had become familiar, cherished. Above them, the stars emerged one by one, witness to this quiet moment of family joy. Look, Tommy pointed suddenly, a shooting star. Quick, make a wish. Sarah closed her eyes, but found she had nothing to wish for. Everything she needed was right here on this terrace. Her son's laughter, Alex's loving presence, and the promise of a future brighter than any star in the sky. The Hansen Industries Gala was everything a celebration should be, but this time Sarah wasn't nervous. She stood proudly beside Alex, watching Tommy charm the crowd in his new bow tie as he explained the scholarship program to potential donors. He's a natural, Emily commented, joining them. Charles is already talking about grooming him for the science division. One step at a time, Sarah laughed. Let him finish elementary school first. Alex's hand found its familiar place on her lower back. Speaking of steps, there's something we need to do before Tommy's presentation. He led them to the center of the ballroom, where Robert Hansen was waiting with a microphone. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. A few months ago, when Alexander Blackwood first approached me about a merger, I thought I was just entering a business arrangement. Instead, I found myself witnessing something remarkable, the transformation of a man I'd known for years into someone new, someone better. Sarah felt Alex's arm tighten around her waist as Robert continued. Love does that to us, when it's real. It breaks down our walls, challenges our assumptions, makes us brave enough to reach for happiness we never thought possible. Tonight, we're not just celebrating a business merger. We're celebrating the merging of families, of dreams, of futures. Alex took the microphone, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. When I first met Sarah, I thought I was executing a perfect business strategy. I had everything planned, a week-long arrangement, a simple transaction. What I didn't plan for was falling in love. The crowd murmured appreciatively, but Sarah barely heard them. Her whole world had narrowed to Alex's face, his voice, the emotion in his eyes. I didn't plan to discover that true strength isn't about control or power, but about being vulnerable enough to let love in. I didn't expect to find a son who would teach me more about wonder and joy than all my years of business success ever did. Tommy had made his way to them, slipping his hand into Sarah's as Alex continued. The contract that brought Sarah into my life expired weeks ago. So today, in front of our family and friends, I want to propose a new one. He reached into his pocket and knelt, producing a ring that caught the light like captured starlight. This contract is for forever. No terms, no conditions, just love. Sarah Miller, Will you marry me? For real this time? Sarah looked at the man kneeling before her. Not the cold CEO she'd first met, but the warm, loving father who read astronomy books with Tommy, who left her coffee by the bed each morning, who had taught her that sometimes the most precious things in life come disguised as business arrangements. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. The room erupted in applause as Alex slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her. Tommy hugged them both, not minding for once when Sarah's happy tears dampened his carefully styled hair. I believe. Robert Hansen's voice cut through the celebration. We have one more announcement to make, Tommy. Tommy straightened his bow tie and walked to the microphone with newfound confidence. As he presented the scholarship program that would bear his name, Sarah saw the same passion for discovery in his eyes that had first drawn Alex's attention to her that morning in the diner. Later, as they danced under the crystal chandeliers, Sarah rested her head on Alex's shoulder. Did you ever imagine that first morning that we'd end up here? Never, he admitted. I thought I was so clever, using marriage as a business strategy. Instead, it used me, showed me everything I'd been missing, everything I didn't know I needed. Speaking of need, Sarah smiled, your son is currently explaining black holes to the chairman of the board. My son, Alex repeated softly, watching Tommy gesture enthusiastically to his captive audience. You know, all those years building my company, I thought I was creating a legacy, but this, you and Tommy, our family, this is the real legacy. Sarah touched the ring on her finger, still getting used to its weight. No more contracts? Just one. He kissed her softly. To love you and Tommy forever. To never let business come before family. To remember that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars or stock prices. Those are good terms, Sarah murmured. I think we can work with those. The evening continued around them. Tommy's successful presentation, congratulations from friends and colleagues, plans for the future spinning out like stars in the vast universe their son loved so much. But for Sarah and Alex, the most precious moment was simply this: standing together, holding each other, knowing that what had started as a business arrangement had bloomed into the most genuine love story either of them could have imagined. Because sometimes Sarah realized the path to happily ever after isn't a straight line. Sometimes it starts with a rich man's proposition and a struggling mother's courage. Sometimes it grows in the space between pretense and truth, in the quiet moments when masks fall away and hearts open despite themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, it leads to something far more precious than any fairy tale ending. It leads to real love, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect in its own way. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a different mirror, in a different dress, but this time there was no pretense involved. The wedding gown was simpler than the designer dresses she'd worn during their charade, but it was perfect, elegant, authentic, and chosen with love rather than strategic necessity. You look beautiful, Mijita, Mrs. Rodriguez said, adjusting the veil, like a real princess. Better than a princess, Emily added, checking the final details. You look like yourself. Sarah touched the delicate necklace at her throat, Alex's grandmother's piece, now permanently hers. I can't believe how much has changed in just a few months. Mom! Tommy burst into the room, his junior groomsman tuxedo slightly rumpled from excitement. Alex is showing everyone my new research paper, the one about Jupiter's moons. Mr. Hansen says they might publish it in the Young Scientist Journal. Sarah knelt carefully, mindful of her dress, to straighten his bow tie. That's wonderful, baby. But remember what we talked about, taking deep breaths when we're excited. Tommy nodded, making a visible effort to calm himself. Sorry, it's just, everything is so perfect. Alex said that after the honeymoon we can start planning. The observatory for the roof. A real one, with a computer-controlled telescope and everything. The door opened again, this time revealing Robert Hansen. It's time, my dear. Are you ready? Sarah took one last look in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't the struggling waitress from the diner, but she wasn't the polished society wife from their pretense either. She was something better, someone real, someone who had found love not by playing a role, but by being brave enough to be herself. "I'm ready," she said, taking Robert's arm. The ceremony was being held in the Hansons' garden, transformed into an enchanted space with twinkling lights that mimicked the stars above. As Sarah walked down the aisle, she saw familiar faces, her old colleagues from the diner and department store, now friends rather than co-workers, the Blackwood Industries board members who had become more like family, and in the front row, Mrs. Rodriguez crying happy tears while filming everything on her phone. But it was Alex's face that held her attention. He stood waiting for her, and the look in his eyes made her heart skip just as it had that night at the opera, that morning in his office, that evening on the terrace when he'd proposed for real. Beside him, Tommy bounced slightly on his toes, barely containing his excitement. When Robert placed her hand in Alex's, Sarah felt the rightness of it all the way to her soul. This wasn't a business arrangement or a social strategy. This was love, pure and simple and real. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, but Sarah barely heard the traditional words. She was lost in Alex's eyes, in the gentle way he held her hands, in the perfect reality of this moment. Their vows were simple, honest, free from the elaborate pretenses that had marked the beginning of their relationship. Alex spoke of learning to love, of finding his heart when he thought he'd locked it away forever. Sarah spoke of courage, of taking chances, of building a family from unexpected beginnings. "And do you, Alexander James Blackwood, take Sarah Elizabeth Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Alex said, his voice strong and sure. "For real, for always, no contracts needed." A ripple of knowing laughter went through the crowd. Their unusual beginning was no secret now, having become something of a romantic legend in their social circle. "And do you, Sarah Elizabeth Miller, take Alexander James Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Sarah said, squeezing Alex's hands, "with all my heart." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Alex's kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise, but it was Tommy's enthusiastic hug that made the moment complete, the three of them holding each other, a family made official in every way that mattered. The reception that followed was elegant but relaxed, nothing like the formal galas they'd attended during their pretense. Tommy moved between tables, proudly showing guests his latest astronomy drawings, while Alex and Sarah danced under the stars that had become such an important part of their story. "Happy?" Alex asked softly, holding her close. "More than I ever thought possible," Sarah replied, resting her head on his shoulder, "though I'm a little worried about what you and Tommy have planned for that observatory." "Should I be concerned about NASA? Getting competition?" Alex laughed, the sound warm and free. "Let's just say the science division at Hanson Industries is very interested in our son's ideas about satellite technology." Our son. The word still made Sarah's heart swell. The adoption had been finalized a month ago, with Tommy proudly announcing to his entire class that he had a dad now, one who loved stars just as much as he did. As they danced, Sarah caught glimpses of their guests, Emily and Charles deep in discussion with Tommy about his research, Mrs. Rodriguez sharing her secret recipe with the Hansons' chef, board members and service staff mingling without regard for corporate hierarchy. This was the world they had created together, one where love and authenticity mattered more than social status or business strategies. "You know," Alex murmured in her ear, "for someone who claims he didn't believe in love, I seem to have fallen, rather completely into it." Sarah smiled up at him. "Maybe you just needed the right business proposition to show you the way." He kissed her then, under the stars they'd both learned to wish on, surrounded by the family they'd built from the most unexpected beginning. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that no fairy tale ending could ever compare to this real, imperfect, absolutely perfect love story they'd written together. 1 year to the day after their first meeting in the diner, Sarah and Alex sat in that same booth, sharing coffee and memories. The diner hadn't changed. Same worn leather seats, same slightly wobbly tables, same smell of coffee and bacon in the air. But they had changed, in all the ways that mattered most. "I can't believe you actually remember which booth it was," Sarah said, stirring her coffee. served in the same thick white mug she'd once carried by the dozen. "Of course I do." Alex's fingers played with her wedding ring. "This is where everything changed, where I saw you handle that difficult customer with such grace and dignity, where I first thought maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than business deals and corporate strategies." "You mean where you hatched your brilliant plan to hire a fake wife?" Sarah teased. "Best business decision I ever made." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Even if it didn't quite work out the way I planned." The bell over the door chimed, and Tommy burst in, followed by a slightly out-of-breath Mrs. Rodriguez. "Dad, Mom, look what they gave me at the Space Center." He proudly displayed a certificate naming him Youth Ambassador for their educational program. At just 9 years old, he was already making waves in the astronomy community with his passion and innovative ideas. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Sarah made room for him in the booth. "Tell us everything." As Tommy launched into an excited description of his day at the Space Center, now a regular part of his educational routine, Sarah watched Alex's face. He was completely engaged in their son's story, asking questions and sharing Tommy's enthusiasm. The cold CEO she'd first met was gone, replaced by a man who understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "And then," Tommy continued, barely pausing for breath, "Dr. Martinez said my idea about using constellations to teach math might actually work. She wants me to present it at the next education conference." "That's my boy," Alex said proudly, always thinking bigger. Mrs. Rodriguez slid into the booth beside them, accepting the coffee Sarah ordered for her. She was family now, having moved into the penthouse's guest suite to be their full-time housekeeper and honorary grandmother. "He was wonderful today," she reported. "Answered all their questions like a true scientist. Though he did try to convince them to add a zero-gravity chamber to the children's section." They all laughed, and Sarah felt her heart overflow with joy. This was her family, not perfect, not conventional, but absolutely real and completely wonderful. Oh. Tommy suddenly remembered something. "Emily called while we were at the Space Center. She says everything's ready for the scholarship ceremony next week. They've selected the first 10 recipients." The Tommy Miller Young Astronomer Fellowship had already garnered national attention, with applications pouring in from talented young scientists across the country. It was amazing how one little boy's passion for the stars had sparked a movement that would help other children reach for their dreams. "Speaking of dreams," Alex said, pulling an envelope from his jacket, "I have something for you both." Sarah opened it to find plans for a new building, the Blackwood Miller Science Center, to be built adjacent to the local children's museum. The designs showed interactive exhibits, a state-of-the-art planetarium, and research facilities dedicated to fostering young scientific minds. "Alex," she breathed, "this is incredible." "It's not just a building," he explained, his eyes bright with excitement. "It's a foundation, a place where kids like Tommy can explore their passion for science without worrying about resources or opportunities, where dreams don't have to be limited by circumstances." Tommy studied the plans with serious concentration. "Can I help design the astronomy section?" "Of course," Alex ruffled his hair. "In fact, I was hoping you'd be my partner in this project, both of you. After all, you're the ones who taught me that the best investments aren't about money, they're about people, about dreams, about making the world a little better than we found it." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their son point out features he wanted to add to the Science Center's design. Through the diner's window, she could see the city skyline where, in just a few years, a new building would stand, not as a monument to corporate success, but as a testament to the power of love to change lives. "You know," she said softly to Alex, "when you first made me that business proposal, I thought I was just doing what was necessary to secure Tommy's future. I never imagined we'd end up here. Here? In this slightly shabby diner with questionable coffee? Here," she squeezed his hand, "building a real future together, changing lives, being a family." Alex kissed her temple softly. "Best contract negotiation ever." Tommy looked up from the plans. "Can we have dinner here more often? I like it. It feels like like where our story started. Sarah met Alex's eyes, seeing in them the same love, wonder, and gratitude she felt in her own heart. Yes, baby, this is exactly where our story started. And you know what? What? It's getting better every day. Outside, the first stars of evening were appearing in the darkening sky. Inside the diner, a family sat together, sharing dreams and plans and love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that some things were destined to be, not in the way of fairy tales and fantasy, but in the way of real love, brave choices, and hearts that recognize each other even across social divides and business arrangements. Sometimes the greatest adventures start with a simple cup of coffee and a business proposal, and sometimes, just sometimes, they lead to the kind of happiness that no amount of money could ever buy.